Hi, I'm Blaise Thompson, and I'm very excited to be here today to present to you about finding clinical trial patients with AI while still maintaining data privacy and security. And I'm one of the founders of Bitfount. So, what's the problem we're trying to tackle? Essentially, it's about finding patients, which it turns out is one of the biggest problems in clinical trials. And it's really, really hard, as many of you probably know. And I almost think it's kind of a completely broken process at the moment. Most trials end up not meeting their recruitment criteria on time or recruitment targets. And I've even read some cases or articles which say that drug development could end almost 2 years earlier if patients were better targeted. Then complex trial criteria make it really, really hard for sites to find the patients. They forget what all the criteria are. There are tens of different criteria that the clinicians have to remember. And it also means that screen failure rates can be very, very high in many trials. Now, that has a huge impact on the sponsors of the trials because for many drugs, if they get to market, they could be earning up to $8 million of revenue per day. So there's a sort of huge cost in just being late to market. But there's also this cost of the screen failures just directly contributing to costs for the sponsors. And ultimately, it means that patients are not getting the drugs that they need as fast as they could be. So what's the solution? Well, we think one of the big parts of the solution is to automatically identify potentially eligible participants using AI. And normally when people talk about running AI, they always mean that it's going to happen in the cloud. And that turns out to be really, really difficult when you're using healthcare data. So a key idea here is that you should be really doing it on premises or in a private cloud that's managed by the institution that has the data. So underlying this concept is that the sponsor still gets to define what the criteria for the trial are. And then you have a federated network like ours, which sends those criteria down to the various sites that have the data. Now, all the data science analyses can then be completed locally, and private data never has to leave the clinic. Conceptually here, what we're basically saying is, instead of sending all the data to the cloud, which is what people normally do, let's send the AI models down to the clinic and do everything locally so that data doesn't have to leave. That obviously has very, very big implications from a data privacy and security perspective. So what does it mean? Well, you can have AI models that target patients using the trial criteria, and you can quickly then increase the patient yield because you're directly finding these patients and helping the sites to find patients. And because you've done a pre-analysis of many of the criteria, you would expect to get a decreased screen failure rate. And all this is being done without data transfer, so you overcome a huge amount of the concern that sites normally have when using AI. So on the left, I've just shown you some screenshots of typical outputs using our platform. So you can generate a report for each patient that's been identified by the trial and explain why the model thinks that the patient is eligible. And then you can produce a spreadsheet for sites to kind of individually look through patients and say whether they agree and check why we've identified them. Okay, so what are all these things that on-premise approaches or private cloud would unlock? Well, with cloud solutions, you have a very slow process convincing strategic teams about the concerns around data loss. Like commercially, it's very concerning to have data, which is potentially a very commercially valuable asset, going outside of the infrastructure of the site. But then on a legal and regulatory side, it's also just very complicated. And so even if the strategic or commercial teams are happy, it just takes a really long time to approve the use of these AI models. And then on a day-to-day basis, what ends up happening is that the clinics just look at individual images, even if this is all approved, and they send those up for the AI model to analyze for either screening or pre-screening, because they don't really feel comfortable sending all data, which would be potentially terabytes of data. So it could be just very expensive or very concerning from a privacy perspective. Then when you run on-premise or in a private cloud, you don't have this concern about the data loss because all the data is not leaving. You also overcome various sovereignty concerns. So for example, if data is in Brazil, it might be difficult to leave Brazil, but that's never a problem because you're just running everything locally. And then you also have a shorter legal approval time because the legal teams are kind of less concerned. And day to day, what it means is that clinics end up being comfortable analyzing their entire data set because it's essentially becoming a pre-screening tool instead of a pre-screening tool instead of a tool just being used by the clinicians or the research teams as they're working. You're probably wondering, does this actually work? And I think there are a few ways that we can think about whether it works. One is just, can we increase trial site yields if you're using AI models like this? And another is, can we reduce screen failures? So we've done a few analyses like this. And the first is a retrospective study. So here what we did is we took this concept and applied it to the case of a geographic atrophy trial. That's an ophthalmology disease. And in this disease, you've got typical screen failure rates of over 50% and recruitment rates of maybe 2 patients per site per year. It can be a little bit faster once the sites are kind of up and running. So that number is kind of more an aggregate number. So we did this analysis retrospectively, taking a data set of about 79,000 patients. And we looked what would have happened in one of these trials if we had used this approach. So the baseline was to just do a health record search for terms like geographic atrophy and also incorporate things like the age requirements of the patients. And that approach found 1,700 patients. Now, of those 1,700 patients, we then had a clinician look at a sample and work out what an expected screen failure rate would be if we were looking at those patients. And based on the clinical assessment, we got to a screen fail rate estimate of about 60%. So we estimate a cohort of about 700 patients would be eligible out of this 1,700. It's actually significantly better, of course, than what you're getting in practice, but this huge screen failure rate is problematic. And I guess also worth saying that even this health record search is something that many sites would not be able to do. This is quite an advanced hospital called Moorfields Hospital in London, and they have advanced technologies which enable them to do this health record search. So we compared that to what would happen if we use an imaging AI approach. And that approach, instead of looking at the health record, it only looked at the image, and it found 1,800 patients. And actually, those patients turned out to be much more likely to be eligible for the trial. So the clinician estimated about a failure rate of 37%, so a huge increase actually in patient yield if we had used that approach. And then combining the two, so kind of being more certain that the patients are eligible, identified a much higher quality list of about 700 patients with a screen failure rate of about 14%, so 600 patients likely to be eligible. So this is already very promising, I think, but admittedly is retrospective, and we weren't able to actually contact any of these patients and actually see if they'd be interested in joining the trial. So more recently, we've gone ahead and taken this concept and started actually using it in a live trial. So this is much more recent, and so we haven't been able to get to larger numbers of patients, but the results are looking very promising. So this is another trial for geographic atrophy, and we've been in about 3 sites for about 3 months each. Again, this once sites are recruiting, we've been told to expect 0.4 patients per site per month, so a little bit higher than the 2 that I mentioned previously, which is across all GA, geographic atrophy trials, and also across the whole recruitment period rather than once sites are up and running. But similar screen failure rates. And so far, we've identified 10 patients, so it's actually a pretty decent number of patients. But it's kind of the beginning phase of these sites starting to run. So only a few of them have gone forward for screening. 2 of them passed, and 2 of them actually ended up being randomized in another trial with the same sponsor. And then we have 6 patients who are still waiting screening. So far, we've essentially not really had any real screen failures, although 2 of these patients actually decided to go with a different trial. And so we're quite excited to see that, this continues going forward. Okay, now another big question, of course, is how easy is it to actually use in different sites? And many of the technologies we've seen in the past for helping to find patients have ended up being US only because of the special regulations that are allowed in the US, and sort of struggle to move over to other continents. So Europe, South America have different regulations and might not be so easy to take some of those approaches. But this approach looks like it's very happily adopted across the globe so far. So we've got sites now in the US, the UK, in Europe, and even in Australia. So far, it's looking very promising that sites are very comfortable with, or at least much more comfortable with this approach of data staying on site and not leaving their premises. So I've talked a lot here about identifying patients for clinical trials, but this same concept of taking models or analyses and running them local without having to transfer data out of the clinic, I think can be applied much more generally. And in fact, our platform supports many, many other capabilities and use cases. So when we've got different AI models, we can deploy them in the way that we've done in clinical trial patient pre-screening, but it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be our models. You can, in fact, the models that we've been using have often been commercial third parties or academic models that have been developed. And there's been a lot of interest in just seeing whether we can evaluate those models on local data, because it's very important to see whether AI models work outside of the setting where they were trained. And then can you train them locally? And that's another thing you can do in the same concept where the data doesn't have to leave. Then you can do analytics in a federated way. You can calculate overlaps between different sites. So, for example, you might have a primary care site and a secondary care, and you want to check which patients are in both of them without sharing anything that's not in the overlap. Sometimes you actually just literally want to transfer data, perhaps with some privacy protection added, or do some kind of longitudinal analysis. So many capabilities which usually people think about needing requirement of transferring data to a cloud, but actually can be done in this federated way. And there are other use cases as well. So we can also find patients for commercial purposes, identify which sites would be best placed to take part in a trial, do transfer of data once a trial is actually running, do data analysis, model comparisons, or even model creation using the training capabilities. So it's been great being here today and really looking forward to the panel later. But I hope I've convinced you that there are many things you can do without having to transfer data out of a clinic or hospital. And it has many, many benefits for privacy, for commercial reasons, and for legislative reasons as well. Thank you.